Hello, everyone, and welcome to the webcast. My name is Christine Dorsey Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio chapter of the American Planning Association, and I am your webcast moderator. Today is Friday, June 18th, and we will hear the presentation, Local Climate Action in Oregon. Is it Oregon or Oregon? Is that a source of debate? It might be. I think we'll have to talk about this. No, there's no debate on this, huh? Okay. Screen is frozen. Here we go. Okay. For technical help during today's webcast, you can type your questions in the chat box found in the GoToWebinar tool panel. And for your content questions related to the presentation, again, just type those in the chat box in your GoToWebinar tool panel. We will answer those at the end of the presentation during the Q&A. And if your question is for a particular panelist, it would help me out if you reference them when you're typing your question in, just so that I can get through as many questions as I can. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our sponsoring APA chapters and divisions for 2021. Thanks to all those participating sponsors for making these webcasts possible and free to members. Today, we're sponsored by APA Oregon. So thanks for joining us this year and for sponsoring today's session. Looking forward to it. Coming up next on your screen is a list of our upcoming sessions. You can see we just squeezed one in. I think I opened that one up maybe 2 days ago, July 9th. We're actually booked pretty deep into November right now. We're just collecting information. So be sure to check out our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast, to register for all of our upcoming sessions. Today's session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. To log those credits, head over to planning.org, log into your My APA account, and from there you can either search by today's title or event number, both of which can be found on our webcast webpage. Again, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. And head on over to Facebook and be sure to like us. Just type in Planning Webcast and we'll pop up. That's where I post any timely important information, like a date or a time change, if you have a cancellation, a reschedule, or when I have new sessions available for you to register for. That's where I'll post all of that good stuff. So be sure to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast in the search box there on YouTube and we'll pop up. We record all of our sessions and we post them on our YouTube channel. We have well over 300 videos. So be sure to subscribe so that you can get notified when we have a new session available. Also, when you head over to ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast to register for our upcoming sessions, we also have links to all of our previous sessions, including their ID numbers, the titles, direct links to the recordings, and links to download PDF copies of the presentation slide decks. So again, head over there for all of your planning webcast needs. With that, I am going to hand it over. Let's see here. There we go. I'm going to hand it over to Brian to do a quick introduction. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Brian, take it away.
Okay, thank you. As she said, I'm Brian Campbell. I'm a retired planner from Oregon, but still very active in APA nationally and at the Oregon chapter, where I'm on the board currently and also the chair of the Education and Outreach Committee. With APA National, I'm on the Legislative and Policy Committee, and through that committee, I've chaired a number of policy guide developments over the last 5 or 6 years. Most recently, I chaired the development of what's now the 2021, the most recent policy guide on climate change, which was a successor to the 2010 document, but since climate is ever changing, and the policy with it, that most recent document is up on the planning.org website. So I'll talk about that in a minute. But first of all, I want to introduce my colleagues here from Oregon who are going to make some presentations on their individual programs. First, we have Andrea Jacob, who leads the Climate Policy and Programs at the City of Portland's Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. So she'll be speaking first, and then Jerry Sordi serves as the Economic Development Supervisor at the City of Corvallis, where his work includes providing support to the Corvallis Climate Action Advisory Board. And then Natalie Rogers is the Climate Action and Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Milwaukee, managing implementation of the city's climate action plan. So what I want to do is just give you a very brief, I mean, this is really very, very brief. I just wanted to mention that if you go to planning.org to the policy sections and then to the APA Climate Change Policy Guide, I think that policy guide has a great deal to say about potential climate actions that you can certainly find a good place for in your work there. It's divided into actually 7 different sections. So depending on what kind of specific policy action you're looking for, the sections, well, the ones that are local to relative to local government are livable built environment, harmony with nature, resilient economy, interwoven equity, healthy communities, and responsible regionalism. And those, of course, are good for to look at to find guidance for comprehensive plans and other long-range planning documents. But as I said, I think they have a lot to say about what can be part of a climate action plan as well. There's one other section which is on federal and state policy. So that's not necessarily relevant at the local level, but it certainly has a lot to say about what you can, what your chapter can do to help foster good climate action at the state and federal level. So with that, I think I'm going to turn it over to Andrea, and we'll go from hear from her. Thanks.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Andrea Jacob. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks good.
Someone just give me, yeah, thank you. As Brian said, I manage climate policy and programs for the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. I started with the city a long time ago, about 16 years prior to actually the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability being the Bureau of Planning and Sustainability. We were the Office of Sustainable Development, and then in 2009 we were merged with the Bureau of Planning. And so I've mostly been on the energy and climate side for most of my career, and fairly recently I've started to work a lot more at the intersection of climate and land use. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Okay. So the presentation overview, Portland has been doing climate planning for a long time. So I'm going to talk about our history, 1993 to 2015, really quickly. Talk a little bit about the climate action plan that came out in 2015, why it was different, what's happened since then, and then talk about a few examples of where the climate and land use work is really intersecting, and then a little preview of what is next for us. So this is a group of planners, Portland Plans. I think most people know that, that we have a long history of both urban planning and climate planning. I don't know if everyone knows that Portland actually was the first metropolitan area in the US to have a local plan for cutting carbon. It came out in the era of the floppy disk, so 1993. The plan has had a few iterations since then. In 2001, we started referring to it as global warming, and we brought in Multnomah County as a partner. In 2009, we updated it, in keeping with the best available science, and then it was updated again in 2015, and that is the sort of last iteration of it. It went through 2020, and so part of what happens next is part of the story. At the same time, the planning side of the Bureau had been engaged in our state mandated comprehensive plan process. So I put a picture of the 2035 comp plan. It does reference climate in one section, in one chapter around environment and watershed health. I think it's referenced, but it's not a major theme in the comp plan. But since then, I would say that the climate plan does have a very long chapter on urban form and mobility, where a lot of the long-range concepts and strategies are brought into the climate action plan. So one of the chapters, it has about 50 actions around everything from transit-oriented development, transportation and transit funding, complete healthy connected neighborhoods, and how all of that, the way that Portland's long-range growth strategy actually is a climate action strategy, because it reduces the need for building, which is very resource and climate and emissions intensive, and for car trips. And so it really is a nice package in the 2015 climate action plan. So there's a lot of or cross-reference between the climate and land use work in the 2015 climate action plan. The other thing that I want to mention about the 2015 climate action plan is really notable in a couple ways, but one of them is because it was the first time that the city of Portland really attempted to address its racial justice history, its racial inequities and disparities, and attempt to put an equity lens on climate. And how we did that was we sort of went through our normal climate action planning process, which was a stakeholder process, and then we had a separate stakeholder process of equity consultants that we resourced to bring to the table. But it was a very top-down approach. We said, here's a list of hundreds of actions that our regular stakeholders over here have developed. What do you think of these? Can you put an equity lens on these? How would we make these actions more equitable? And what we learned out of that process is that it took a long time for folks to really be able to metabolize what those actions were. They were not in language that were familiar to community members. And so what started out as what we thought would be kind of just like a technical advisory group on equity really changed our whole frame on how we look and think about climate action. And the conversation and the practice of it really started to shift as a result of the lessons learned from the 2015 climate action plan. So what happened since 2015 is that there's been an increasing recognition and mobilization from our Black and Indigenous and people of color communities that climate change does not impact us all in the same way, that frontline communities and youth are hit first and worst, that youth especially will be facing the consequences of our decisions for the rest of our lives, and that climate action that doesn't center the voices and the needs and the priorities of frontline communities is not going to get us to our goals. And so part of this activism, I think, happened around a resolution that was passed in 2017. It's called our 100% Renewable Energy Resolution. And so this is post-climate action plan, but it really explicitly recognizes past harm. It calls for repair and justice, and making sure that those historically left out of the process and those who have not really benefited from our climate investments have a front seat or have a seat and drive the conversation, and also really shifting the conversation around community priorities, which are expressed around anti-displacement and energy cost burden and housing affordability and health and safety. And then we had the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund. For folks that aren't from Portland or Oregon, this is a pretty groundbreaking citizen initiative. It was on our ballot. It was led by a frontline community coalition that basically resulted in the passage of a gross receipts tax on our largest retailers in Portland, and it goes to fund the Portland Clean Energy Community Benefits Fund, which is really aimed at making sure that community organizations have the capacity and the funding to engage in climate solutions. And so this is an amazing new resource and funding stream for climate action, really focused on Black and Indigenous people of color. It's a grant program that nonprofits are the recipients, and they can partner with lots of folks in the private sector and elsewhere, but it's really about these homegrown local businesses and nonprofits that are driving climate action. And we've started to make rounds of funding. It's a really powerful program, and we hope that it's replicated in other parts of the country. And then last year, just about a year ago, our city council adopted the climate emergency declaration, which again is really recognizing that it's a human-made emergency. It's here now. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. And the major inequity is that the people that bear the greatest brunt are the people least responsible for creating the problem in the first place. And so all of the mobilization and resource really needs, again, to center frontline communities. The Climate Emergency Declaration also updates our carbon emissions targets from the 2015 Climate Action Plan. So this is the home now for our targets that are call for a 50% reduction in carbon by 2030, and then a net zero carbon or 100% reduction in carbon emissions by 2050. And the resolution is really long. It's about 10 pages, and it doesn't just talk about decarbonization or, taking the carbon out of the economy. It talks about those community priorities around anti-displacement and transportation justice and transit access and affordability. It talks about fossil fuel infrastructure and limiting that. It talks about urban heat island and trees and green infrastructure. So we are in the process of bringing a report to council. That's a one-year progress report. It's going to update council on the work that we were able to accomplish in the last year, which is, as everyone knows, not a very normal year. But I wanted to highlight a few things that are mentioned in the Climate Emergency Declaration and also in our past plans that were really at the nexus of land use and climate. Some of you may have heard about our fossil fuel terminal zoning amendments. This is zoning code changes that restrict the development and expansion of bulk fossil fuel terminals. This has had a storied history, I guess, in the sense that as soon as council passed it, we were sued, and the amendments have been the subject of the Land Use Board of Appeals for the last couple of years. It's in remand now, and the city of Portland is attempting to answer some of the questions and inquiries that came out of that land use appeals process, and hopefully we'll get it back to city council at some point. But I think it's a really interesting example of where we try to lead with some of the authority. We're very limited in our authority actually in Oregon around doing things around climate because the electricity and gas sector are regulated at the state level and building codes are regulated at the state level. The zoning code is the local authority, and it's one of our tools that we're most comfortable using. But even still, when you try to push the boundaries, the system pushes back. So I mentioned that as an ongoing body of work that really is at the heart of climate and land use. Another major effort around making our housing ready for electric vehicles. And this is a cross-team project at the Bureau of Planning Sustainability involving our planners and the emerging mobility and electric vehicle policy analyst that's on my team. And the goal here is to increase the percentage of EV-ready parking spaces in new construction of commercial and multi-dwelling and mixed-use buildings that have 5 or more residential units. And this, because I mentioned that the building codes are regulated at the state level, this involved a lot of advocacy in the legislative process. And it also requires a lot of coordination with our building and permitting department, the Bureau of Development Services. So again, a really good example of how the climate and land use worlds intersect around decarbonization goals. And then the last example I want to give is a pretty emerging area kind of in response to the COVID pandemic and what's happened to downtowns everywhere, and Portland is no exception, maybe is a little of exception, I'm not sure. I haven't been anywhere in a year, but downtown Portland and Central City have been especially hard hit by the pandemic, by ongoing racial justice and policing protests and crisis, a real acceleration in houselessness and things like that. So as the Central City, we have a Central City 2035 plan, but the planners are realizing that we could never have predicted COVID. And so as we're coming out of COVID, we need to really relook at some of those actions in our Central City plan. And the planners have reached out to the climate team. So as we look at these strategies around our streets and activating streets and being more flexible in our land use approaches, that climate and energy are brought into the mix. And in some of the big policy moves that we're making on the climate team, really dovetail well with how we should think about central city recovery, specifically around use of the right-of-way and curb space. So can we be thinking about electric and autonomous vehicles as we're reconsidering the use of streets in the central city? Our buildings, we're working very hard on a regulation and a set of ordinances that would regulate carbon out of existing buildings. And we have a lot of empty buildings and vacant space in the central city now. Is there a nexus between making those buildings carbon free and repurposing them, or what is going to happen with those buildings? We need to make sure that that's considered as we start to regulate buildings more. And then also a new focus on embodied carbon, which is really about the building materials. When we talk about reducing carbon from buildings, we usually talk about it as as they're operated, how they're heated and powered. But being mindful of what you're building, what materials you're building with in the first place is a really important part of the carbon puzzle, and one we really haven't addressed. So as we build back better, hopefully we'll be interweaving all of these climate big moves into how we think about land use. So I just want to leave you with, despite all our amazing work, we are at about 20% below our baseline as of our most recent carbon inventory year, 2018. It's amazing progress. Our goal is to be 50% by 2030, as I mentioned, and 100% by 2050. If we were to continue on our current trajectory of sort of the same level of resourcing and effort, we will not hit it. And so we really need to accelerate the funding and resourcing for the bureaus that do most of this work, which are planning and sustainability and transportation. We've got 8.5 years to hit that 2030 goal. The impacts are not equitable. The crisis is accelerating. The easy stuff's been done. So we need some political courage to get us to our goals by 2030. And with that, I am going to change presenters.
Thanks, Andrea. Can you see me okay?
You look great.
Awesome. All right. Again, just another quick introduction for me. My name is Jerry Sordi. I work for the City of Corvallis in the Corvallis-Benton County Economic Development Office. We're City of Corvallis employees, and our office took over staff support of the Climate Action Advisory Board, which I'll talk about in a minute, in mid-2019. Just a little bit about Corvallis. Corvallis has about a population of about 59,000 people and is home to Oregon State University. So of that population, some people, I think we estimate about half of that population is student population. So definitely a college town. And Corvallis is located about 90 miles south of Portland. What I'd like to talk about today is really a focus on the implementation of our climate action plan and how we are trying to get some climate projects off the ground. I think that some of the things that I'll touch on will be really relevant to smaller cities, cities without large funding streams that can be dedicated to planning efforts. And so hopefully, and then I'll end with my contact information, and I'd love to hear your ideas, and I hope that you would reach out to me if you have ideas that you think might be helpful for here in Corvallis. Just a little bit of history. So in Corvallis, there was a group of community members that created a climate action plan back in 2015, and the city council decided, hey, let's go with this and make this a formal effort. And so that process, the planning process, culminated into a climate action plan that was adopted in 2016. After that time, there was a climate action task force that continued working to try to chart a path for implementation. Then a climate action advisory board was created back in 2018. And they did some work, again, trying to get organized, trying to figure out what the priorities for the city were. And then it built to a point where our office, the Economic Development Office, took over as staff support in 2019. So let me jump forward, but one of the things that we found with the climate action plan is that it's taken a long time to get the community actions off the ground. And I think that one of the reasons that happened was implementation was not deeply embedded into the actual plan itself. So our plan created two categories of actions. It created municipal operations actions that we were going to use to decrease our carbon emissions at a city level. Then it also created a whole set of actions for community, for the community to use. And the Climate Action Advisory Board was set up as a group that would advise the City Council on how to move forward. So there's kind of, I would say at the beginning, there was a question of how to get started. So with the community projects, this is an example from our plan, and it has a strategy and it has an action associated with that. So this is an example for something for energy conservation, increasing deployment of energy efficiency improvements. So with our plan, which is about 81 pages long, there's this continuous question of where do we start, what tools do we have, and what tools do we need? When the Climate Action Advisory Board began meeting, the city had adopted, had hired a staff person who acted essentially as a facilitator. And she worked with the board to work on projects, but really didn't have that connection with the City of Corvallis staff, didn't have a home department. And I would say because of that, the CAB, it seemed to sort of work in isolation as it was started to move forward. When our office, the Economic Development Office, took over to provide staff support, I think we had a better connection with the other departments in the city so that we could start reaching across departments, whether we were talking about public works related projects or community development related projects. We could then get a conversation going internally to hopefully get some climate actions moving forward. So I would say after a couple of years of wheels spinning a little bit, we're starting to get some traction in putting together some priorities at the city and then getting some projects moving. And one thing that helped with that was $100,000 was moved towards climate projects in the FY 19-20 budget. And that gave the CAB an opportunity to start to prioritize their projects and really start to focus in on what they thought would be achievable projects that could move forward with that budget. And the group finally narrowed in on a climate action revolving loan program, a solar inventory of commercial buildings. We've got a grant for heat pump installation and a bicycle wayfinding signs program. The revolving loan program, we've just started to receive applications under that, and it's set up for nonprofit organizations who are working on energy efficiency projects and other climate-related projects in our community. So we received 2 applications. Again, this is an emerging project that we're working on, and I think one of them will help to work with lower income individuals in our community to install hybrid water heaters. There's another application to do energy improvements to a specific church building. And we'll continue to market the program. And I think that will be a way that we can just get some projects moving in our community to start taking some steps. We've also found that, an advisory board can only do so much in terms of moving us forward to meet our carbon reduction goals. So we've as staff, we've tried to find ways that we can work on projects that don't require necessarily ongoing oversight by an advisory board. And one thing that we found is that the pandemic did provide an opportunity for departments within the city of Corvallis to start thinking about how we use public space. So fairly quickly during the pandemic, we created a program to be able to use city right-of-way for street dining, retail, or other business use. And we've been administering that program for now over a year. And I think that that process has really gotten departments within the city talking to each other and maybe taking a fresh look at how public space can be used. We also have a Climate Action Advisory Board group, CAB group, working on moving forward the home energy score concept in Corvallis. So this is a project that's been implemented in other cities, but it would require that prior to a home sale, a person go through an energy audit through the home energy score, and it provides feedback to potential buyers for how a residence could be improved to have better energy efficiency. Another staff-led project is that we applied for a grant through Pacific Power, the Clean Fuels Program, through their electric mobility program, to create a local e-bike incentive program. So we have $60,000 at the city that we're working to push directly into subsidizing the purchase of e-bikes in Corvallis. And we've targeted our program towards lower income individuals. And that's another project that is actually starting to go live, taking applications today. Interesting note about e-bikes is that during the pandemic, there has been just really intense demand for bicycles and e-bikes. So where I think we could get really good traction if we went back in time 2 years ago to do an e-bike incentive program. The supply of e-bikes is really low right now in Corvallis and other places. So we've got to temper expectations a little bit. But this is just an example of how we're approaching climate action, which is really to, at least at some level, take the opportunities through grants and other funding sources to try to just move projects forward that are local and homegrown. I wanted to add a slide about metrics because when we started assisting in climate efforts, there was a continual drumbeat to do a greenhouse gas inventory. And so we've done greenhouse gas inventories. I just wanted to put up this bar chart on the right in particular, because I think that when if you create a greenhouse gas inventory in your community, you just want to understand that some of the data that you have available to you is going to be pretty hard data. Other data is probably coming from some aggregated model. So we were able to get pretty hard data from our utilities on natural gas, electricity, solid waste, the consumption of goods and services, though, which really accounts for a large amount of carbon emissions. We ran through a model, so we just don't have access to that data. So I would just advise that if you're a community that's getting started with climate planning, it may make sense to really focus on those things that you can actually measure, because if a model changes, like I remember when we were putting together our 2018 inventory, we ran our numbers through a model 1 month, but then the model changed 2 months later and skewed our data because we were using aggregated model data. So I just wanted to put this slide in to encourage people to think about metrics, about what you can actually measure accurately, and maybe focus on those. We've learned some lessons, and I think one of the main lessons that we've learned that I would want to encourage others to think about is that when you plan for climate action, plan with implementation in mind. And so when you get a whole bunch of people together and you get a project moving, I think you really want to use that opportunity with your city council, with the community, to be very specific in the actions that the community plans to take if the climate action plan is adopted. So it needs to be an action plan, an actual action plan with dates, times, people, and funding sources identified, or else you might experience some of what we've experienced, which is basically now we're having to go back, put together that schedule, and have all of these conversations, I think, over again, where they could have been combined into maybe a more cohesive planning effort. Also encourage communities to understand your tools. So again, like with the pandemic, we learned that the use of city right-of-way, that's a tool, that space that could be allocated to things other than just automobile use, be it bike ped projects or dining or other activities within the right-of-way. Most cities control a lot of right-of-way, and that can be an area that can be a tool that could be a part of your projects. Prioritization, of course, important. and really like figuring out a process. And this is something that we're working on how to make big ideas become real. How do you run bold policy initiatives and just any policy initiative that's climate related in the future? How should that process look? And again, those are things that we're working on currently, and then I'm optimistic that we'll start to refine and get more traction as we move forward. And then continuing to engage the community, I think is really important. So one thing that's unique, I would say, about the Economic Development Office, and I've worked previously as a planner, is that we spend a lot of time just out in the community, talking with people, getting feedback, and just having our face forward in the community. I think that that's really important because you can talk about projects with people. So I've met the owners of the bike shops in our town, and I talked to them about biking and kind of what they're seeing. You can really use that information to create, I think, targeted and effective programs. And then you get feedback and you kind of hear what people are talking about. And I think that can be very useful as well. So those I think are like the core concepts that I would want to convey to anybody getting started with climate planning, or maybe taking a fresh look at what they're working on. But I'm always curious what other folks are doing, so please feel free to send me your ideas, and if you have any questions, please let me know. All right, so I'm going to turn things over. 1 second. All right, Natalie.
Great. All right, let me see. Let me click through these buttons real quick. Okay. Can everyone see my screen?
Looks good.
Great. Fantastic. Well, thank you for the invitation to be here. And now I'm seeing my own screen. What is happening here? Hold on. There we go. I don't know what's going on. So my name is Natalie Rogers. I'm the Climate Action and Sustainability Coordinator for the City of Milwaukee. It was great to hear the presenters before me, because I've been a longtime resident of the Portland area, and I actually went to Oregon State University, so I also lived in Corvallis as well. I work for the City of Milwaukee, which I'll show you where it is. It's a small community southeast of Portland, but still in the metropolitan area. I implement our climate action plan, which was adopted in 2018. I actually have a really great position working within our public works department. And so I get to work really closely with not only our public works department, but also our planning department, engineering, and all the other departments at the City of Milwaukee. I just wanted to point out, just because I know that folks might not be familiar with the Portland area, and then also the Milwaukee with an IE and not the double E. The Superior Milwaukee is the IE, I have to say. So we're a small community, only about 20,000 residents southeast of Portland. You can see it outlined here in red with the red arrow. We're adjacent to the Willamette River, so we have a great scenery and a very kind of small town feel, even though we're kind of within this larger metropolitan area. Milwaukee, we're primarily residential, and I included our zoning map for our planning folks here. And you can see that we do have some small industrial kind of pockets. So we have a few kind of big players of industry within Milwaukee, but mostly it's a kind of a small bed community with a lot of single family residential. And we're starting to work on some more middle housing and kind of increasing the housing density due to community needs. And I just wanted to also show our greenhouse gas inventory. And I do want to reiterate just what you heard about small communities and greenhouse gas inventories in particular, and the assumptions that need to go into calculating those inventories. But we can get a general picture of where our emissions come from. And this is kind of how we look to see where we should be prioritizing our climate action work. So you can see building energy is our largest emission sector within Milwaukee, and this inventory was done in 2016, and we're doing another inventory this year. So I'm interested to see how that changes. Followed by transportation. And so this kind of changes a lot of the work that I do and the partners that I really try to foster strong relationships with in order to make the most effective reductions in greenhouse gases for our community. But definitely baked into these numbers are a lot of assumptions, and that's a challenge, particularly for small communities, especially in areas like transportation, where Milwaukee's only a few square miles, and so there's a lot of cars moving in and out of Milwaukee, and a lot of the folks that live in Milwaukee might not work in Milwaukee, and vice versa. So it's something just to keep in mind when you're looking at inventories, particularly for small communities. So in 2017, Milwaukee took a award-winning visioning process, actually led by our planning department. And from that, we came out as a community that by 2040 wanted to be delightfully livable and completely sustainable. That kind of led our city council to have a council goal of developing a climate action plan. And so in 2018, our Public Works Department, led by our Public Works Director, Peter Passarelli, took the city on a climate action plan development process. And so this climate action plan development consisted of a climate action planning committee, which was seated by community residents, as well as local businesses, local industry representatives, as well as representatives from our utilities and other kind of regional partners like our county partners. There was also technical work groups, which were maybe more staffed by, city staff, as well as other technical experts to weigh in on topics ranging from land use and transportation to building energy and public health and preparedness. There was a lot of community engagement considering the size of our community in developing our climate action plan, including we made sure to have a Spanish-speaking focus group, and as well as a larger climate action summit, which you can see is that bigger picture here, where it was kind of a town hall, you could say, where we invited the broader community to come and weigh in on the climate actions that were being proposed in our climate action plan to ensure that they were right-sized and appropriate for our community. That's really important, especially as we just heard from Corvallis, where some of these actions that are kind of common across climate action plans you can see in the nation. While the overall goal is, I would say, similar for every community, the approach that we take to get there needs to be different depending on the staff size of that community, as well as just, the influence of the community and how we can garner the most support within the community. So coming from this climate action plan development process, we kind of ended up with these three main goals for carbon reduction. And I will say I have a little asterisk here because in 2020, the city of Milwaukee was the first city in the state of Oregon to declare a climate emergency. And in that climate emergency declaration, our city council accelerated our climate goals by 5 years. So our new climate goals might not be the same that you see within our climate action plan, but that's because that emergency declaration accelerated them. So by 2030, the city of Milwaukee is hoping to be a net zero carbon city from electricity. We've had further discussions with our city council to say, what does this mean? Because when you start to get into the electricity and energy realm, that can mean a lot of things. And so what we've come to get from it is that by 2030, we want to be only using carbon-free electricity in Milwaukee. So not using any sort of offsets or other things to kind of bring us to zero. By 2035, Milwaukee wants to be a net zero carbon from all building energy types. So that includes natural gas, that includes oil, and other kind of heating fuels that are maybe more challenging to decarbonize. And then by 2045, Milwaukee aims to be a completely carbon neutral community. So by either using offsets or other strategies to mitigate our carbon emissions, we want to be completely carbon neutral. And there's a lot of challenges, and as you've seen with the past presentations, our own kind of trajectory shows that we still have a gap to close to reach that point. There's kind of a fourth goal within our climate action plan, and that's increasing our canopy cover to 40%. We in the community see that as a very big action and important action to take in order to reduce our contributions, because there's sequestration when it comes to urban forest, but also provide the maximum amount of benefits to our community through tree plantings, which could be some of the most cost-effective ways to both provide the co-benefits of trees to our community, but also climate benefits. So coming from our climate action plan, we kind of ended up with these 6 major topics through 53 city-led actions, meaning that the city is going to be the primary initiator and facilitator. So we have building energy and efficiency actions, vehicles and fuels, land use and transportation, and this is really where the emphasis on our planning team comes in, but they're involved in almost every single one of these topics. Materials use, purchasing and recovery, natural resources, and public health and emergency preparedness. Oh, and I will say too, I'm not going to focus on some of the other projects. I'm going to be focusing on our comprehensive plan in this presentation, but there's a lot of really great things that we're doing to address each of these topics, and we're kind of biting off what we can chew. And really, as a limited staff, and kind of we need to be strategic in how we're investing our resources and time. A lot of these actions that we're implementing and that are in process right now are through really strategic partnerships in our region, as well as just making sure that the actions that we developed align with either actions that the city is already kind of wanting to do and we're implementing a climate lens to it, or just opportunities that exist in our community to just better it and that align with kind of what our community wants to move forward with. So for example, in our land use and transportation section, we do have highlight our Safe Access for Everyone program, which is our SAFE program, which is building out alternative transportation infrastructure in the community, such as bike lanes and sidewalks. And so we ensured that that was included in our climate action plan development, because it's kind of a 2 birds in 1 stone situation where we're both promoting alternative transportation as well as providing the community need and benefit of having alternative transportation. So the Milwaukee Comprehensive Plan, we're kind of unique in that, we had this community visioning in 2017, which then led to a community climate action plan in 2018. And then following that, we had a 2019 urban forest management plan, and that kind of came from that 40% canopy goal call out in 2018, as well as reference to naturing a verdant canopy in our 2017 community vision. And so all of these plans, we kind of had to take into account then when our planning department was proceeding with development of our comprehensive plan. So I did like this is from our Milwaukee community vision, but in 2040, Milwaukee is a flourishing city that is entirely equitable, delightfully livable, and completely sustainable. Milwaukee nurtures a verdant canopy of beneficial trees, promotes sustainable development, and is a net zero energy city. So as you can see in our community vision, there's a lot of policies that you would have to implement to achieve that align with our climate action plan. So I remember our planning director in 2019, when we started working on kind of incorporating these plans into our 2020 comp plan, was saying that, we might be working a little backwards. Typically what happens is you have these policies in the comp plan, and then from that, you create these strategic plans on how to implement them. But it was kind of nice to have these goals that were set out within our 2018 and 19 urban forest and climate action plans in order to justify and show community support for some of the larger policies that were coming out of our 2020 plan. And I'll say too that this was a award-winning visioning process, and our comp plan also, I believe, won some accolades as well. So our planning team did a fantastic job on it, and it's a great document to review, and I'm happy to share it. I know this is a lot of text, so don't let your eyes cross, don't worry about it. I just wanted to show you that as Andrea mentioned in her presentation, there's the statewide planning goals that need to be addressed in our comprehensive plan. And energy conservation and natural resources, environmental quality, these were all necessary to address in our comprehensive plan. However, our planning team really did a fantastic job of calling out climate change and energy in its own section to really emphasize the importance that it plays in our community's future. So some of these great goals and policies coming out include addressing the built environment and energy efficiency and climate resiliency. We also specifically call out our 40% citywide tree canopy goal and developing more energy efficient land use. And this is through, infill and cluster development, but then this ties into kind of the implementation, which I'll talk to you about shortly, which we're in the process of right now. We also address the transportation and utility infrastructure, showing that we need greater redundancy, resiliency, energy conservation, and more. And all of this really ties back to some of the actions that we have in our climate action plan as well. Another goal, which I really like, addresses adaptation and mitigation. And essentially, it's showing that the community is informed and prepared to address a changing climate. And I think that really ties back to our public health and preparedness, but then also, Milwaukee is doing a great job of including climate change in whenever we're considering natural hazards. And that actually, while surprising, isn't common in a lot of larger planning documents, because, it's kind of a series of consequences and cause and effects that lead down to something like wildfires, that lead to increased flooding risks and air quality. And now we're starting to see that that's all tying back upstream to climate change. So it's great that Milwaukee is putting that in here and essentially calling it out as a significant issue and potentially the greatest environmental hazard that is facing humans right now. So right now, we got our comprehensive plan adopted in 2020, which is fantastic. And then our planning team dove straight into implementation. And so right now we're in phase 1 of implementation, which focuses on housing, trees, and parking. And this kind of aligns with a House Bill 2001, which is a housing bill that Oregon passed, where essentially it opens up single family residential zones to middle housing types. And that, we're seeing it maybe in some more larger cities, just driven by the market, but the zoning within Milwaukee doesn't necessarily allow for these kind of tighter developments on smaller lots. And so our planning team right now is leading us through essentially a process to open up zoning to allow for these middle housing types, which aligns very well with our climate action plan, particularly as building energy and efficiency is our largest sector of emissions. Smaller builds both allow for increased density for climate refugees, but then also they typically can be more energy efficient just based on the volume of air that they need to heat and cool through HVAC systems. And then also we can nestle them really well within the community rather than maybe a larger a home that might take up more space and really take up more open land and undeveloped land. And so the big climate influence coming out of this that I'm really delighted to see is essentially we're hoping to provide flexibility in housing design to limit trade-offs. And by that, I mean, when there's a particular site being developed, if there's a beautiful tree or a grove of trees, right now we might not be able to, but in the future, we're hoping to provide more flexibility when developing housing types for that lot to allow for preservation of those trees or spaces while still getting the increased occupancy on site. So trees were also introduced in this phase 1 because as we're talking about providing flexibility in design, Milwaukee doesn't currently have a private tree code. So 80% of Milwaukee's trees or urban canopy actually is on private property. And so that means that the large percentage of our urban forests that we're hoping to grow to 40% by 2040 is really out of the community's influence or guidance through code and policy. So private tree code was a really important thing for us to implement, and it's also within our urban forest management plan as a suggestion in order to emphasize tree preservation and mitigation and reach that 40% canopy goal. So we're working on a private tree code right now with assistance from the planning department as well as our tree board, which is a community-led board that advises city council to develop a private tree code. We already have a public tree code and we're hoping to mirror a lot of the learnings from that public tree code into the private tree code. But it really just, increases the stringency of tree preservation, which is particularly important in our area. And then the final thing that's being addressed in this phase 1 implementation is parking. So parking reduction is an action in our climate action plan. And that's because of all the learnings and kind of visionings that we're seeing for the future of hopefully increasing microtransit and public transit and making a more walkable community, which will lead to hopefully a reduction in personal vehicle need. We also have EV charging considerations that need to play in somewhere where, as Andrea mentioned, multifamily housing for EV charging, but then also, you know, for every person who has an EV, theoretically, if they want to charge at home, they need an outlet close by. So that's something to consider for parking strategies. And so we're including, hopefully, some lens of that within our discussions around parking on site for this phase 1 of implementation. Our planning team also explored true parking demand within our community. That's one thing that I think that I've been learning through this process, is that the community might I don't want to say exaggerate, but perceive a larger demand for parking than actually is what we're actually seeing through studies in our community. And so having that data coming out of it can kind of right size what parking ratios we actually have and need in certain areas in our community. And then the biggest thing, importance relating from climate to this parking phase 1 development, is simply more flexibility in design. Right now, you know, you need a certain amount of space for the site to have on-site parking. However, if you're doing a site design plan, what if there's a beautiful tree that you'd like to preserve instead? Can we offer up flexibility to essentially have that tree stay on site, but still have the parking available for that, that site? So I think the climate action plan, which then influenced the comprehensive plan, is really helping now to guide us in development of this new code in the phase 1 process. That code hopefully will go in for adoption in, I think, winter of 2021 or 2022. And I'm happy to connect folks with our amazing planning team if they have any questions about it, because they are neck deep in it right now. But I also just wanted to highlight that there's some other kind of climate influences in our city code that we've been focusing on until the adoption of this first phase of our comprehensive plan. And then later, I will also say there's going to be natural resources. This is the first phase of many of our comprehensive plan into city code. One thing that we have, which you heard from Corvallis on their slide, but then City of Portland has this program and launched it first in our region, is the Home Energy Score program. So this is essentially a residential energy disclosure code, performance rating and disclosure code, where when somebody is selling their home and listing it publicly for sale, they need to get an energy usage assessment, essentially, of the home that evaluates the assets that go with that home sale. And then they need to include that on the home listing. And that's really important because it essentially can provide consumer protection, it influences the market, but it just brings energy efficiency to the forefront when people are considering probably the largest purchase decision in their life. We also have a green building code where we offer up essentially a floor incentive and an additional floor if a developer pursues an energy efficiency or some sort of energy rating system. So we have Energy Trust of Oregon in Oregon, and they have like a path to net zero, which is a good example that we applied to our own city library construction that essentially proves that the building will be more energy efficient. And then finally, we're also looking into EV charging our community. This is something where I think there's a lot of partners in the region who are exploring it, but then at the same time, you know, there's still a question over who should actually invest in the infrastructure and what is the local government's role in influencing those chargers around the community. So we're also pursuing EV ready code for particularly multifamily and commercial sites. And in Oregon, it's unique in that, I think actually quite a few states have this, but we're capped by the state building code, so we can't require building above base code for the state. And so the question is, where does EV code fit in that? Is it in land use? Is it in building code? And I think we're still exploring that right now, as well as other kind of opportunities to have more energy efficient building code, hopefully through legislation. But in the meantime, we're working with partners. So PGE, Portland General Electric, is our utility partner. And this is an example of a public charging station that they installed in our downtown corridor. but just making sure that we're promoting incentives for public vehicle charging installations. And as a small community, one of the best things that you can do is essentially advocate and promote partners in your region that are offering incentives and programs, because it just helps increase the tools in your toolkit without increasing your city budget needs. So they're great partners for us, and hopefully we'll be seeing some more chargers in the right of way in public spaces to come. So, but that's another space where the climate action plan can influence city code. And that's pretty much what I have, but of course, I'm happy to talk more about what climate action work that the city of Milwaukee is doing. I love particularly talking to other small communities, because I think there's a suite of unique challenges that come from implementing climate action in small communities. And I think there's a lot of lessons learned that we can share. So thank you so much, and I appreciate the opportunity to be here.
Okay, let's go ahead and jump into some Q&A here. Folks, again, if you have questions, just type them in the chat box and we'll see what we can get to. Let's first start out with some questions for Andrea. This one says, I'm a planner for a smaller town in Oregon with a conservative city council. I have a hard time convincing them that addressing climate change and climate resilient adaptation are important. Any ideas for me to help them come around? So Andrea, let's start with you, and then maybe we can kind of circle around everyone and see what we can come up with.
Yeah, I hear that. I think some of the ways around it, I feel, are to actually not focus on climate or environment, but to really focus on energy independence, self-reliance, local economic development, economic opportunity that comes from clean energy in particular. It doesn't really need to be a partisan issue. Climate tends to be highly charged, but energy and renewable energy in particular, and energy independence messages. And I know that resilience and self-reliance we work with a lot of organizations at downstate and in Eastern Oregon, where definitely the climate and carbon message is not gonna fly. So I would just sort of say, like, look at the framing of it. And I guess since there are two smaller Oregon cities on the call, pass it to Jerry and Natalie for whatever you would add.
Yeah, I would. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Jerry. I would jump in. I'd echo what Andrea says. I think one of the most important things to do is, when you're looking at climate action, is to highlight the co-benefits of each action. So, there's a lot of community value in essentially what falls within our climate action plans. And as I mentioned, a lot of the work in our climate action plan, I believe the community would still want to pursue, just maybe with a different lens applied to it. So alternative transportation is great for community walkability, for promoting local businesses and increasing foot traffic to those stores. Trees provide stormwater utility cost benefits. It provides shading and mental health, and increases property values, at least in the Pacific Northwest. So highlight those as justifications for why you're pursuing it. And a lot of communities like Hood River in Oregon, they have an energy independence planning process, which Andrea highlighted. And, there's, I think, a lot of co-benefits to each of the climate actions. And then maybe the thing to do would just be to talk internally with your department to figure out the best way to frame each one that maybe doesn't use the word climate, but maybe uses a community improvement.
I definitely echo Andrea and Natalie. The city of Corvallis is the only place that I've worked that I would consider as not a conservative municipality. So I've worked in a number of conservative municipalities, and I think you focus on multiple benefits. A lot of the conservative places in Oregon are resource-based communities that are trying to leverage tourism at some level. So an EV charging station is a great way to encourage tourism to your town. The other thing that I would recommend is just building trust in the community, because I think that a lot of times leaders, when they hear climate, they may put you into a certain political group but I think that is lessened if you let people know who you are, you talk with them about concepts, ideas, get feedbacks. What do you think about solar? What do you think about EV charging? And just have that conversation outside of just like a staff report recommendation at a city council meeting. And you've got to be talking about these things and getting feedback outside of the formal channels. So I would definitely encourage you to go out, talk with city councilors or whoever it might be that you think are thought leaders in your community.
Thank you. Okay, this question is actually mine. I'm hearing you use the word, several of you have used the word houseless versus homeless. Maybe this is just me and this is the first time that I'm hearing this. Can we talk about this? Is there a difference? Is this just a new trend? Break this down for me. What's the difference?
I don't know if I want to kick this off to Andrea. From what I've heard from our economic development and housing team is just, you could have a home without a house is what it boils down to. And so houseless community is one without housing versus one without homes.
Andrea?
Yeah, I don't have any. That's exactly it. It's
okay.
And less pejorative in a way.
Okay. Next, Andrea, let's go back to you again. This question is, I am working with a group founded by a young Latina woman. We have come to realize that we can't deal effectively with climate change without dealing with housing justice. And to deal with housing justice, we came to realize that we must deal at the federal level with tax policy, monetary policy and fiscal policy, as well as housing policy. So clearly there's a domino effect here, right? When will Portland come to this conclusion? When will some of these major cities see that that there is this kind of ripple effect, and that there's other areas, housing, tax policy, that play into climate? Can we talk a little bit about that? What is being done to kind of address some of those like problems that have to do with it?
I mean, I appreciate the point. I think it's a question for Portland City Council, not so. I mean, I'm not the Housing Bureau. I don't mean to punt, but there's, to some degree, I think the Land Use and Climate Bureau is addressing the housing crisis through what Natalie mentioned, the middle housing. We had a multi-year residential infill project, which looked at extensive community engagement to look at where we could add different types of housing in residential zones. It was pretty contentious. And went through many different amendments with the Planning and Sustainability Commission and Council. And I could share a website, project website that could tell you exactly where it is today. But that's one of the ways that we've looked at it, and it's our angle on the housing issue. But we, City of Portland's planning and development directors meet. The budget over the last 10 or 12 years, as far as I can tell, has always city budgets bureaus have continued to take cuts even in boom years to fund affordable housing and affordability, to try and address, which is basically a supply and demand issue. And so it's a complicated issue. And it's very upstream. I think that, when the Land Use Bureau kind of addresses it more in a downstream place, but I think really from a community development perspective and a community engagement perspective, this is something that I think City Council has to struggle with, and our commission form of government makes it pretty challenging. So it's a fair question. I only have a limited line of sight into it.
Thank you. Let's shift, and this is going to be kind of for everyone, and I'm going to sort of frame this, and then we can get into a couple questions about it. So with COVID, we found that a lot of folks found themselves working from home. They're not having to commute. We've read these great stories about waterways that are cleaner than they've ever been, or there's the air quality is just incredible in some of our big cities and metros that have been known to have just terrible air quality. So I guess we can look at that as an upside to COVID. And now that we're starting to get back into the swing of things, I think at least from what I'm seeing, there's this idea that things aren't going to go back the way that they were, that there's going to be this sort of hybrid work life now where some people will just continue to stay at home and some people will go back to work or do a little bit of both. So with that, are you expecting to see any difference in what the climate is going to be doing in your communities? Are you seeing that that your climate, that things are improving, that your environment is looking better? I know also that there's a big workforce issue right now and housing workforce issue, workforce housing. So at the same time that some people are going to be staying home permanently, others are traveling far for work, or, you know, there's like all of these, I guess, big kind of issues circling around. And so if maybe each one of you could take a few moments to sort of give your perspective about what's going on in relation to the fallout from COVID in terms of the future of our communities in terms of climate.
Yeah, I'll jump in to start. As far as seeing environmental quality improvements from folks staying home and maybe industry not being as active, for small communities like Milwaukee, my science brain, I can't say that I've seen anything measurable. Definitely, I think but I mean, for the Portland metro region on a whole, I think that might be an interesting question to ask our partners over at maybe Department of Environmental Quality for the state. But in terms of what has been highlighted through kind of this experience of everyone being home, definitely, you know, there's this overwhelming question around, you know, equity and internet access and such. But for the climate lens, I think one thing that stands out to me is how much our community came out in force to talk about the value of green spaces in their community, as well as alternative transportation and walkability. You know, folks are home, particularly with small children, and they want to be able to take them to parks. And that's something that we've really been hearing is this, the importance of a walkable park in a community. I also think that it really maybe brought to light some of the community-focused concerns with people not being able to access like grocery stores within their neighborhoods, or essentially taking maybe a wider lens and bringing it down to the neighborhood in terms of community reflection. And I think implementing that into our own climate action work, tying it back to those co-benefits, I think it just really reinforces some of the work that we're doing on really promoting livability through climate adaptation, mitigation, and resiliency in our neighborhoods, and being able to frame that maybe into the most pertinent and relevant concerns that our community members have. And so I know that moving forward, I'll be definitely working more around the equity issue on accessibility of green spaces for Milwaukee.
Go. I think this will be an interesting question to keep watching as things move forward. I mean, definitely the pandemic has opened up discussions about how we use public space, right-of-way, streets, parking lots. Corvallis has a lot of people commuting in each day in a normal time period from Albany, Lebanon, Sweet Home, all over the place. And I know that nobody misses the commute. So I would say, you know, the question mark is that just having been around organizations, you know, some organizations are going to want people back in the office, others may be more flexible. So I would encourage people to have those dialogues with their supervisors and see if there's some hybrid model. But I think the discussion about public space has been beneficial. I think, you know, there's probably a little bit more interest in bike ped because, again, all the bike shops are sold out of bikes right now, so people are out trying their bicycle. I would also say that, you know, I feel like, at least in Corvallis, people use spaces that are safe on the streets. So we have to continue to move forward to try to make our streets safer for bicycles and pedestrians. And that's not going to change overnight. So this will be an interesting experience to track.
I think my colleagues captured a lot of it. I don't have too much more to add. I think Natalie hit on the digital divide, and that is a really, I think our Bureau has a smart cities program, and really right after the pandemic hit, a lot of us pivoted into response, and rather than, like, you know, a lot of people shifted their work plan in early 2020 and mid 2020. And so our smart cities team went into high gear around figuring out how to access Chromebooks for community members, and put together an amazing program. So, you know, and then all of that around the repurposing of streets and public spaces that they mentioned are the things that are the subject of our, especially of our central city recovery work. And I think people have enjoyed the dining on street and using streets in different ways, and car-free streets. And you know, I think one thing I didn't mention is an effort in Portland around pricing options for equitable mobility, which is looking at pricing different parts of the transportation system to encourage, you know, a basic principle of social marketing is you know, increase benefits or reduce barriers to the behaviors you want to see. And part of that is, you know, using incentives or pricing to discourage negative behavior. And so I think we might look at, I know that a group of community members has been looking at things like car-free zones within the central city and things like that. So I don't think we are going to see a sustained and permanent reduction in carbon emissions. Like globally, we did when everybody stopped flying for a few months last year. I mean, but I think our bounce back, they always predict the bounce backs are actually worse. And I think we're starting to see that. So there's just no way to be complacent right now. And it just, at the moment, we need to be accelerating all of this work. You know, I feel like our electeds are very caught in near-term emergency around the housing crisis. We have public trash, we have broken, you know, plywood on downtown, so quite a lot. You know, there's certain pockets of downtown where you would not know anything was really amiss, and then others where it just really is not okay. And so it's hard to get their focus on climate right now. It's just a slower moving crisis. But I think, you know, I think we're trying very hard to tie COVID recovery to climate as much as we can, every way that we can, in every venue where that conversation's happening.
Thank you. And to your point about the digital divide, here in Ohio right now, we're waiting on pins and needles about the next budget. And right now, our state Congress is in conference duking out the budget. And one of the things that came up this year is to remove municipal broadband, which can, in effect, really add to that digital divide. Just, you know, leaving the private sector to kind of take the digital world where it wants to. And just from my research, I found out there's actually quite a few states that that have restrictions on municipal broadband. So PSA, take a look, do a little homework, see what you see. Next question is for Natalie. It says, I love Milwaukee's tree canopy coverage goals. Is there a code requirement for canopy coverage for all new development? And what are the strategies to implement that goal?
That's a great question, and one that we're working through in our private tree code development process right now. So, you know, the biggest question when it comes into the private development is how much should you emphasize preservation and how much should you emphasize site design flexibility in new plantings? So, you know, we're looking at taking kind of a dual approach. We're looking at essentially limiting the amount of tree canopy that can be removed. So saying maybe you can only remove 33% of the tree canopy in total when you're developing the site, but then also having replanting requirements, and then appropriate, removal fees, and to kind of discourage those removal of species. One thing that's really kind of being highlighted when we're developing our private tree code, which our tree board and folks are kind of wanting it to be a little bit more stringent than other tree codes in our region that exist right now for other kind of municipalities, is just how, our planning team is so great, and they keep saying, like, we need clear and objective standards, but then how discretionary trees are, and tree decisions can be on a site, particularly with new development. An example being, if you have a new development coming in and maybe there's a grove of young oaks, which are Oregon white oaks, which are a really prized species in our region, on one corner of the lot, but they're really young, versus maybe one larger maple tree. And if you go purely by what's offering the most canopy cover, you would be choosing the maple tree to preserve rather than maybe the younger, maybe potentially more habitat value or valuable species 40, 50 years from now. So how do you bake that into a clear and objective standard or code process? And it's really complicated. So when working with new development, I think what we're trying to do is set up bounds and restrictions that essentially, enforce folks to put some thought behind it when they're developing a site plan, but then also knowing that there's probably going to be some discretionary process associated with them having to go to our planning commission and working with their planning department and our urban forester to really come to the best decision for that site. And then there's different restrictions for when you're doing a planned development on a site versus if it's just a private property owner working with an individual or a few trees. So there's just a few pronged approaches that we have to look into, and just knowing that it can't maybe be very clear and objective, and we gotta have to maybe have a little bit of discussion in the process.
Thank you. There are quite a few questions regarding environmental justice, and so I think I would like to spend the remainder of our time addressing that in ways in which each of you are working with the topic of equity in climate, everything, resiliency, adaptation, all of environmental justice. If you could each just take a minute or two. I know that's kind of 2 minutes isn't very much, but or at least, provide space for where folks can get more information on how you all are addressing environmental justice.
Can I just
Andrea.
ask you to read like just a handful, just to give us a flavor of the questions, like just not all of them, but just a smattering?
Yeah. I'd love to hear more about how equity is being included in climate implementation. How are you working towards environmental justice? Oops.
Okay. So pretty.
There's another one about just Portland and Oregon facing issues with equity, and how are you adapting to renewable energy within that? So just very basic. Okay. They just want more. They just want to know more basics.
That sounds good. I guess I'll give 2 examples. So I mentioned the climate emergency declaration, which at its heart is an expression of climate justice policy, even though it mixes some like hard decarbonization targets and specific planning processes with more aspirational kinds of statements. But something that it does speak to in the first part of the Be It Resolved is that we will work with community members to establish a climate justice initiative. And it's pretty vague about what that is. It says the city shall really support structure and process and resource it. And the terms around this have been, it's like a design space, it's a third space, it's not a government-led space, it's a community-led space, but it is supported and resourced by government. And the idea is that in reaction to kind of a climate action planning process where we give you all 200 actions to review and put an equity lens on, we're saying, here's a space where folks can come together and talk about climate action and solutions that are community centered, but really with a focus on capacity building around intervening in the policy process in the local government. And I think a really powerful example was around, that was given to me by some of my staff, were around, like at one point, the transportation network companies like Uber and Lyft were in negotiations with the Department of Transportation around, those companies using, being permitted and allowed to use, to operate in Portland. And so I think the city of Portland was sort of, the staff were not really thinking about community priority first, and not really thinking about community perspective on ride hailing vehicles, and kind of folks from our bureau that were part of those conversations were like, if we're not having this conversation right now about, TNCs in Portland without community at the table, just us sort of saying, oh, but whatever we do will create jobs for Black and Indigenous people of color. That just like sort of giving this kind of, here, we put something in here for you, rather than having folks at the table being able to negotiate directly or be part of those conversations about what does employment look like, what are the workforce opportunities, what about Black ownership, what about all of these conversations. If we never even stop to think about who's at the table when these conversations are happening, and how does community even know when those conversations are happening? So it's this idea of a climate justice initiative is taking shape, and it's taken shape over the last year and a half, and it's being resourced by philanthropic community as well as supported by the city, and it's really like a user or human-centered design. So space. So I can't even tell you like what it will produce, like what policies will come out of it. I don't know. Will it affect my work plan at some point? Maybe not. It's really co-creative. It's really collaborative. It's hard to explain, and therefore it confuses the system. And sort of my job is to sort of kind of hold space for it and trust the process. I mean, really amazing things have come out of the community over the last several years, including the Portland Clean Energy Fund. So that's one thing. The Climate Justice Initiative has been stood up, it's been resourced, it is taking shape. The second thing I want to mention is really a specific process and community engagement style around our building performance standards, like how we're going to regulate carbon from existing buildings. There's an emerging policy tool called a building performance standard, where instead of really telling the buildings like what to do, you say, here's the standard you need to meet, you figure out how to get carbon out of your building by certain interim standards, aiming towards 0 by 50. But instead of the city just saying, this is our great policy idea, we really started with a different question. We said, how would we get to net zero buildings centering racial equity? And so over the last several years, a community group that is pretty much exclusively Black and Brown and Indigenous folks, working through a process supported by the city with some city staff, but really, again, located in community, to develop a net zero carbon buildings roadmap. And the priorities that they have come to and the way they've come to it and the lived experience that they bring to it is very different than me as a policy analyst saying, hey, I think we should regulate large commercial buildings like this. They're saying, we actually want to focus on rental housing. We're energy cost burdened. We have experiences with landlords and being renters, and it sucks. But we also know that landlords have no incentive to pay for this, so we got to fix that. And so who's benefiting by these policies and who's burdened? Let's really make a different look at that. And they are making recommendations around what the building ordinance should look like. We will definitely engage the mainstream stakeholders, the regulated parties, all of their trade associations at some point. But really the conversation started with community. It really started with the city, and then we really tried to flip the narrative, and we gave the reins over entirely to community. And I've just been in a watching and supporting role in that too over the last several years. And one thing I'll say, and I'll end it because I know we're at time, is that that it does take a lot of time. Like almost all of these processes that started out with certain timelines, all of them have been extended a year, 2 years by doing community work. You really have to do it at the speed that community is willing to go. I'm sorry I took up all your time, people. I got on a roll.
That's okay. Jerry, Natalie?
I might lead with a little bit of a disclaimer in that I don't necessarily know what environmental justice means to the people who are asking questions, but I want to hit on a couple of points. First and foremost, our office has made a concerted effort to be in our community, talking with different populations in our community and thought leaders there to try to get feedback for how the city can be proactive in meeting community needs around things like economic development, because we are that office, and then it also flows into our climate work. So a couple of things. We pushed money towards our local community action agency that works with low-income individuals to help install heat pumps in several houses. We're working with a local group that works with low-income folks to install hybrid water heaters. With our e-bike program, we created an advisory board that spans, I think, a number of populations in our community, and we're targeting our program towards folks who are in the low income earning levels, and we've made our application forms really easy to comply with. So we're getting those out to as many people as possible. And one tactic that we're taking with our e-bike program, again, this is a $1,200 instant rebate for a purchase of an e-bike at a bike shop in Benton County. One method that we use is we open up an application window for about 3 or 4 weeks. And then everybody can apply, and we take a lottery to whom we award the instant rebates. And one thing that an application window does like that is it means that if it takes you 2 or 3 weeks to find a certain group of people, they still have an opportunity to be a part of the program, because we'll use a lottery to make those awards. So I would say, and then the final parting shot would be, we're working to try to build our community so that people can afford to live here. Because we talk about housing prices and how there's an affordability crisis, but we have to remember that housing and transportation go together. Because if you're spending a lot on your housing and a lot on your transportation, you're in a tight spot. But if you can reduce your transportation costs, that also frees up money in individuals' budgets. So we're working on the housing side. Our planning department has a missing middle housing project that's in the works. Other projects across various departments, but we're trying to look at what it costs to live in Corvallis from a more holistic perspective, and I think transportation plays a large role in that.
I'll be really brief, but pretty much our climate action work, when our plan was developed, we didn't have anyone at the city of Milwaukee who was an expert in working on these kind of equity concerns. I'm really happy to say that equity became a council goal last year, and now we have an equity program manager. I think income affordability definitely was something that was prioritized in developing our climate action plan and considerations with each of our actions. But hopefully in the future, we can work more closely with our staff and apply the appropriate equity DEI lens to programs as we work forward in the future, as well as updates to our climate action plan and engagement. And I think it's just a work in progress for many small communities, including Milwaukee, and I'm excited to see where that leads us.
Thank you. This was great. Thank you to the APA Oregon for hosting today, and for the 3 of you for joining us. This was a really great conversation. Folks, just as a reminder, we are recording the session. We'll post it on our YouTube channel. Just search Planning Webcast on YouTube and we'll pop up. And we'll also put up a copy of the slide deck on our webcast webpage, ohioplanning.org/planningwebcast. The session has been approved for 1.5 CM credits for live viewing. So for those of you that need your credits, be sure to register those. And I think that's it. Again, thank you. And everyone have a great weekend, and we'll talk next time.